humanity did not go extinct by accident. It was managed. In the year 2199, a classified authority learned the final truth of survival. The future cannot be saved by invention. It can only be saved by removal. So they began extracting moments from history, events, decisions, births. Each extraction stabilized the species, and each one fractured reality a little more, until a field operative discovered the ultimate violation. Their own birth was scheduled for deletion. This is not a story about time travel. This is a manual about who controls causality and who pays the price.
Chapter 1.
Chapter 1. When Survival Requires Erasure. For most of recorded history, humanity believed survival was an act of addition. More technology, more energy, more expansion. But that belief collapsed the moment the first extinction forecasts reached certainty. The models were precise, cold, unemotional. They did not predict if humanity would end, only when. Climate cascades, resource exhaustion, socio-political collapse, probability wars stacking upon probability wars. No single catastrophe, just an inevitable convergence. That was when the doctrine changed. That was when the phrase entered official language, spoken first in sealed chambers, then repeated until it sounded like truth. Survival is subtraction. The Temporal Authority was born not as a government, but as a correction mechanism, a last instrument designed to edit reality itself. Their mandate was simple in language and infinite in consequence: remove destabilizing moments from history to preserve the species. They did not conquer worlds, they did not rule populations, they erased causes. A riot before it inspired a revolution. A discovery before it disrupted balance. A birth before it altered the future too much. Survival is subtraction. Field operatives learned this phrase before they learned their own names. One of them stood now inside the extraction chamber, watching the past unfold on a curved wall of light. The room hummed with temporal machinery, deep, rhythmic vibrations that resonated in bone more than ear. Time was never silent. It screamed quietly, constantly, if you knew how to listen. The operative, designated only as Unit K-17, observed a small moment by historical standards, a decision made in a hospital corridor, a signature on a digital form, a delay of 7 minutes. Insignificant by old definitions, catastrophic by new ones. This delay would ripple outward. The child born from it would grow, inspire others, fracture a political alignment, and trigger a resource conflict 87 years later. The models were clear. Probability clusters glowed red. The authority did not hate this child. Hatred required emotion. The authority dealt in math. K-17 initiated the extraction sequence. The room's hum deepened. Light folded inward. The moment collapsed, neatly removed, like a faulty line of code. Somewhere in the past, a corridor emptied faster. A life did not begin. History adjusted its posture and continued walking. Survival is subtraction. K-17 exhaled slowly, though breath was unnecessary. Operatives were trained to mimic human rhythms, breathing, blinking, pausing, because unchecked efficiency led to psychological drift. Even tools needed boundaries. As the chamber reset, K-17 felt the familiar afterimage, a faint pressure behind the eyes, a ghost of something that never existed. Temporal recoil, the medics called it, reality's way of reminding you that it had been altered. You cannot feel the timeline, instructors always warned. Feeling led to hesitation. Hesitation led to extinction. Yet, despite conditioning, something lingered. Not guilt, operatives were purged of that early. Not doubt, doubt was inefficient. It was something quieter, a question that returned after every mission, no matter how clean the extraction. How much can you remove before nothing holds? The authorities' philosophy was elegant. Humanity no longer adapted forward. Adaptation was too slow, too chaotic. Instead, it edited backward. Problems were solved at the root. Futures were stabilized before they grew dangerous. And the public never knew. Citizens lived inside a curated timeline, one where disasters narrowly missed, where certain ideas never emerged, where certain people were never born. They called it peace. They called it progress. They never called it absence. K-17 exited the chamber into a dark glass and soft light. Other operatives passed in silence, each carrying fragments of erased realities inside neural buffers scheduled for deletion. No one spoke unless required. Speech created memory. Memory created identity. Identity complicated obedience. Still, as K-17 walked, the phrase echoed again, uninvited. Survival is subtraction. It was meant to be a law. It was beginning to sound like a confession. Somewhere deep within the authorities' archives, there were redacted files labeled causal spine integrity, records suggesting that too many extractions in proximity caused fractures, micro-instabilities, echoes, events that tried to happen anyway. Rumors officially, noise in the data unofficially. K-17 had never accessed those files. Clearance was restricted. Curiosity was monitored. But curiosity, like time, had momentum. As K-17 reached the transit lift, a faint anomaly flickered across the corridor lights. Just a blink, just a stutter. Most operatives wouldn't notice. K-17 did. For a fraction of a second, the glass reflected not one figure, but two, slightly out of sync. A delayed echo, as if reality itself hesitated. Then it was gone. The system stabilized. The corridor returned to normal. A soft tone signaled mission completion. And yet somewhere in the vast architecture of time, something had registered the subtraction. Something had noticed the erasure. And it was beginning to ask its own question. What happens when survival erases the wrong thing? The lift doors closed. The descent began. And for the first time since training, K-17 wondered, not about humanity's future, but about their own origin.
Chapter 2.
Chapter 2. The Birth of the Temporal Authority. Long before time was edited, it was measured. Humanity's earliest attempts to understand the future relied on prediction, statistics, trend analysis, climate models, social simulations. Governments built vast forecasting engines, neural systems that digested everything from ocean currents to human sentiment. They called them oracles, though they never admitted it publicly. The oracles did not see destiny. They saw probability. And probability, when mapped deeply enough, revealed something unexpected. The future was not a branching tree, but a structure, dense, layered, reinforced by repeating decisions and inherited conditions. A spine. Scientists began calling it the causal spine, the load-bearing sequence of events without which the future collapsed into chaos. Remove a minor branch, and the system adjusted. Damage the spine, and everything above it failed. The phrase emerged from a closed symposium, spoken first as a warning. Every future has a spine. Break it carefully. At the time, it was theoretical. Then came the breakthrough. A research team studying quantum gravity anomalies discovered that certain moments in space-time behaved like anchors. These causal anchors resisted alteration. They were moments of unusually high informational density. Births, discoveries, convergences, events where probability collapsed sharply into outcome. When the team simulated the removal of non-anchor events, timelines self-corrected, history flexed. But when they touched an anchor, the simulation destabilized violently. Reality, it seemed, could bend, but it did not like being cut. To test the theory, the team ran an illegal experiment. They targeted a low-impact anchor, a failed business meeting, obscure by historical standards, and applied a controlled temporal extraction using entangled chronons and negative time mass. The math was elegant. The execution was terrifying. The moment vanished, and the world did not end. Instead, something subtler happened. Data shifted. People reported misplaced memories. A city's economic growth diverged by fractions of a percent. The timeline absorbed the loss, but not without cost. The scientists called this cost timeline debt. Every extraction created a deficit, an imbalance that reality would attempt to reconcile later. The more anchors removed, the greater the debt accumulated. Too much debt, the models warned, and the future would default. The report was sealed within hours. What began as curiosity became fear. What began as fear became funding. What became funding became authority. The first mandate was defensive: prevent extinction by relieving pressure points in history, remove the events most likely to trigger irreversible cascades. Small cuts, careful cuts. Every future has a spine. Break it carefully. Publicly, nothing changed. Privately, a new infrastructure grew beneath civilization. Temporal arrays buried under cities, quantum reactors humming in silence, observation nodes watching the past like a living organism. The organization that coordinated it all was not called a government. Governments were bound by time. This entity operated across it. They named it the Temporal Authority. At first, their actions were limited, almost surgical. A war that never started, a technology delayed just long enough, a charismatic leader who never survived childhood illness. Each success reinforced the belief that they were protecting humanity from itself. And protection, once validated, demanded permanence. As decades passed, the authority refined its models. Predictive engines grew more confident, more aggressive. The definition of destabilizing expanded. Events once tolerated became unacceptable risks. Control crept forward under the language of care. Just one more extraction, just one more adjustment, just one more safeguard. Every future has a spine. Break it carefully. But care is subjective, and power recalibrates perception. The authority stopped asking whether an event must be removed and began asking whether it should. Probability thresholds tightened. Tolerance for uncertainty shrank. They were no longer preventing extinction. They were preventing deviation. Operatives like K-17 were born into this evolved mandate, trained within a system that framed time as a resource to be managed. They were taught the science, but not the history. Tools worked best when they did not question their design. Yet, deep within the authority's oldest data vaults, early warnings remained. Notes from the first scientists, unresolved equations, margins marked with concern. One phrase appeared repeatedly in those forgotten files: timeline debt compounds. The models now extended centuries ahead, projecting a future stabilized to perfection. No wars, no collapses, no surprises. A smooth, unbroken line of controlled progress. Too smooth. Somewhere in the deeper simulations, anomalies flickered, events that should not occur, individuals who resisted erasure statistically, probability spikes without identifiable cause. Reality, it seemed, was developing calluses. As the authority prepared for its most ambitious phase, large-scale spine corrections, an internal alert rippled through restricted channels. A minor discrepancy, a causal echo linked to a recent extraction. It involved an operative, Unit K-17. The system flagged the anomaly and queued it for later review. After all, there was time. There was always time. And yet, in the silent layers beneath the authority's confidence, the debt continued to grow, quiet, compounding, waiting for a moment when reality would demand payment. Every future has a spine. Break it carefully. The question no one asked anymore was simple. What happens when the spine breaks back?
Chapter 3.
Chapter 3. training the operatives who rewrite reality. The first thing the operatives were taught was not how to travel through time. It was how to not belong to it. Training began long before recruitment papers were signed, long before candidates understood what they were being shaped into. The authority identified suitable minds early, individuals with low temporal attachment scores, high pattern tolerance, and an unusual ability to dissociate without panic. Children who could watch events without inserting themselves into them. Adolescents who felt more like observers than participants. They called it aptitude. The candidates called it nothing at all. By the time awareness formed, the process was already underway. The training complexes were built outside ordinary chronology, facilities anchored to stabilized time pockets where minutes could be stretched into days and memories folded inward for examination. The air inside these places carried a constant hum, the sound of chronon flow regulated just enough to keep reality from drifting. From the first cycle, the mantra was introduced, spoken softly, repeatedly, until it felt less like instruction and more like gravity. Do not feel the timeline. At first, conditioning focused on emotional suppression. Operatives were shown historical footage, wars, births, extinctions, celebrations, then trained to observe physiological responses without reaction. Heart rate elevated? Acknowledge it. Do not respond. Tears forming? Note the moisture. Do not interpret it. Emotion, they were told, created friction. Friction destabilized precision. Do not feel the timeline. Next came identity detachment. Names were removed, histories blurred. Candidates were encouraged to refer to themselves by designation only. Personal pronouns were discouraged, then forbidden. The self, instructors explained, was merely a narrative construct, useful in society, dangerous in time manipulation. A timeline did not care who you thought you were. Operatives were immersed in simulated extractions, forced to watch moments collapse, lives truncated, decisions erased. At first, many resisted. Some begged the simulation to stop. Some dissociated completely. Those who could not stabilize were quietly reassigned. Those who adapted progressed. Memory was the final obstacle. The authority discovered early that the human mind resisted temporal interference by clinging to coherence. Contradictions created stress. Stress led to fracture. To solve this, they implemented recursive memory wipes, localized resets that removed emotional residue while preserving functional knowledge. An operative might remember executing an extraction without remembering how it felt to do so. Over time, the process became seamless. A mission concluded, a wipe executed, a calm restored. Do not feel the timeline. Unit K-17 completed training faster than most. Instructors noted the efficiency with approval, though some flagged it as abnormal. K-17 absorbed doctrine without resistance, executed simulations with near-perfect detachment, and showed minimal memory bleed after wipes. From the outside, K-17 appeared ideal. From the inside, something else was happening. Between sessions, during the quiet moments when the hum of the facility softened, K-17 experienced flickers, not memories exactly, more like impressions, a sensation of standing somewhere else, a smell that did not belong, a voice just out of reach. The medics called it benign temporal echo, common, harmless. They increased the frequency of wipes. The echoes did not stop. During advanced conditioning, operatives were taught to anchor themselves to authority logic during missions, a sequence of phrases repeated internally to maintain alignment. Survival is subtraction. Precision over empathy. Do not feel the timeline. These phrases became mental handholds, something to grip when reality shifted beneath them. K-17 used them often, and yet during one high-level simulation, a mass extraction scenario involving a collapsing colony, something went wrong. As the moment unraveled, K-17 felt a surge of disorientation, not fear, Recognition. The faces in the simulation blurred, then sharpened. One figure looked directly at K-17 as the extraction initiated. It should not have been possible. Simulations were not interactive. The figure mouthed a single word. Why? K-17 terminated the simulation manually. The room fell silent. Instructors intervened, initiating an emergency wipe. When K-17 came back online, the anomaly was gone, at least officially. But the question lingered. Why? The Authority never asked operatives to understand their actions. Understanding led to interpretation. Interpretation led to deviation. They were asked only to function. The parallel was not lost on K-17, though the thought formed slowly, carefully. Countless people across history trained the same way, conditioned to perform roles, suppress instincts, ignore fracture in the name of efficiency. The system worked because it trained individuals to distrust their own sensations. Do not feel the timeline. As K-17 completed final certification, an internal metric flagged increased cognitive resilience. The Authority approved immediate deployment. There was no ceremony, no acknowledgement of transition. Tools did not require recognition. On the eve of the first live mission, K-17 stood alone in a transit chamber, the walls alive with faint temporal readouts. The hum of machinery vibrated through the floor, steady and patient. For a moment, just a moment, K-17 felt something press against the edge of awareness, a presence, a pull, almost like the timeline was pushing back. K-17 steadied their breathing, repeated the mantra, and stepped forward. Do not feel the timeline. But as the chamber activated and the light began to fold, a single thought slipped through the conditioning, quiet, persistent, impossible to erase. What if feeling it is the only way to know when it breaks? The extraction sequence engaged, and somewhere, beyond training, beyond doctrine, something watched the operative cross a threshold that could not be wiped away.
Chapter 4.
Chapter 4. The First Fractures in Time. The fractures did not announce themselves. They whispered. At first, the anomalies appeared as statistical noise, outliers buried in data streams too vast for any single human mind to notice. Slight increases in déjà vu reports, minor discrepancies in historical archives, conflicting eyewitness accounts that could not be reconciled, no matter how many times the files were corrected. The Authority classified them as benign temporal artifacts. Reality, they said, was merely adjusting. But adjustment has a sound. Across the cities of the stabilized future, people began pausing mid-step, struck by the sensation that they had already lived the moment unfolding around them. A conversation repeated itself word for word. A child reached for an object before it fell. The streetlight flickered in a pattern that felt rehearsed. They called these events déjà vu storms, localized bursts of temporal overlap where erased probabilities briefly resurfaced. Most passed within seconds. Some did not. Unit K-17 first encountered a storm while embedded in a low-impact observation zone. The assignment was routine: monitor for extraction aftershocks following a minor causal edit. The environment appeared stable, weather normal, population density within acceptable ranges. Then the hum changed. Not the mechanical hum of the Authority instruments, but something deeper, more organic. A vibration in the air, like the echo of the sound that had no origin point. People stopped walking. A woman on a transit platform stared at her hands, flexing her fingers slowly as if testing their reality. A man laughed, then fell silent, eyes wide, whispering the same sentence again and again. I remember this. I remember this. I remember this. Reality remembers what power tries to forget. K-17 recorded the anomaly, voice steady, posture controlled. Training held. Conditioning functioned. Do not feel the timeline. But the storm intensified. Images bled through the environment, faint, translucent impressions layered over the present. A billboard briefly displayed an advertisement for a product that never existed. A building shimmered, its facade momentarily replaced by an older design from a deleted decade. These were historical echoes, residual imprints of removed events attempting to reassert coherence. The Authority had predicted echoes in theory, but not at this frequency, not this clarity. The extraction responsible had been small, insignificant by mandate standards, and yet the debt was speaking. As K-17 moved through the platform, the echoing intensified near certain individuals, children, artists, unregistered thinkers, minds less anchored to Authority-curated narratives. Reality found its cracks where imagination lived. A child looked directly at K-17 and tilted their head. "Why do you look sad?" the child asked. K-17 froze. Operatives were trained to avoid interaction during anomalies. Interaction increased instability. "I am not sad," K-17 replied automatically. The child frowned. "You were before." Security protocols activated. The storm collapsed moments later, leaving behind silence, confusion, and a growing data file labeled Memory Bleed Event 0317. Memory bleed became the Authority's next problem. Citizens began recalling events that official history denied, a war that never happened, a sibling who did not exist, a city that had been erased before they were born. These memories were inconsistent, fragmented, and impossible to verify, yet they carried emotional weight. People mourned losses no one else remembered. They celebrated anniversaries without cause. Reality remembers what power tries to forget. The Authority responded with patches, neural dampeners, media recalibrations, localized wipes. For a time, the measures worked. But causality was not a machine that could be silenced indefinitely. Each fracture increased the likelihood of another. Déjà vu storms overlapped, echoes grew bolder. Memory bleed became contagious, spreading through shared narratives, art, and rumor. Some citizens began calling it the haunting of the unlived. Within the Authority, analysts grew uneasy. The models still predicted stability, but confidence intervals widened. Timeline debt metrics crept upward, ignored but undeniable. K-17 was reassigned repeatedly, sent to observe fracture zones. With each mission, the anomalies felt closer, more personal. Echoes lingered longer in K-17's perception than they should have. Once, during a routine scan, K-17 saw a reflection that did not match current designation. An older face, softer, unconditioned. The image vanished as quickly as it appeared. A residual hallucination, medics said. They increased the wipe schedule again. It did not help. The fractures were no longer isolated incidents. They were forming patterns, converging around certain dates, certain individuals, and always, always around K-17 who never meant to matter. Late one cycle, in a restricted analysis chamber, K-17 accessed a fragment of suppressed data during a routine diagnostic. It was a log from an early extraction, one marked critical. The entry was brief. Anchor destabilized, resistance detected, reality adaptation incomplete. Beneath it, a handwritten note scanned into the system from an era before digital purity. You can bend causality, you cannot command it. Reality remembers what power tries to forget. As alarms sounded elsewhere in the facility, another storm, another fracture, K-17 closed the file, heart rate elevated beyond training parameters. For the first time, the question felt unavoidable. If reality was remembering, what exactly was it trying to bring back? And why did it keep circling one operative who was never meant to matter? Outside the chamber, time continued to hum, strained and restless, like a spine bearing too much weight, preparing to crack where no one was looking.
Chapter 5.
Chapter 5. When the Timeline Fights Back. The authority had always assumed resistance would look like rebellion, uprisings, sabotage, ideology. They prepared for enemies with faces. They did not prepare for resistance without intent. Because when the timeline fought back, it did not do so with anger or awareness. It responded the way any complex system responds when pushed beyond tolerance. It corrected itself. The first confirmed case was logged as a clerical error. A child appeared in a census registry who did not correspond to any recorded birth. No hospital records, no parental application. Genetic data incomplete, as if stitched together from incompatible sources. Investigators flagged the entry, prepared a cleanup extraction. Before authorization could be issued, the child was already gone. Not erased, integrated. Neighbors remembered her. Teachers recalled her progress. A bedroom existed where none should have been. Every attempt to isolate the anomaly only increased its entanglement with the surrounding timeline. Reality had accepted the contradiction. The analysts ran simulations overnight. Probability engines strained, models folding in on themselves. One conclusion emerged repeatedly, no matter the variables. The universe is not passive. It was not merely absorbing edits. It was compensating for them. Soon there were others. Individuals with no causal lineage, people who could not be traced backward without encountering voids where events had been removed. They existed anyway, born from statistical pressure, from unresolved debt, from the timeline's refusal to collapse neatly. They called them convergence. People born because reality needed balance. Events began repeating as well. Accidents that occurred despite prior extractions. Political movements resurfacing under different names with different leaders, carrying the same momentum. A speech delivered word for word by someone who had never heard it. The universe was rerouting around damage. The universe was learning. The universe is not passive. Unit K-17 was assigned to investigate a convergence cluster forming in a coastal megacity. The brief was concise: observe only. Do not intervene. The authority wanted to understand the mechanism before attempting suppression. From orbit, the city looked calm, lights steady, infrastructure intact. But as K-17 descended, the hum returned, louder this time, closer to the skin. On the streets, people moved with an unfamiliar confidence. Conversations carried a strange density, as if each exchange contained more meaning than it should. Murals appeared overnight, depicting symbols no one could explain. Spirals intersecting spines, lines bending back into themselves. Motifs of return. K-17 passed a public screen broadcasting archival footage. For a fraction of a second, the image glitched, showing an event K-17 recognized but knew had been erased. The feed corrected itself immediately. No one else seemed to notice. K-17 did. Reality remembers what power tries to forget. Inside a community center repurposed from an old data hub, K-17 observed a gathering of convergence. They were not organized, no leader, no manifesto. They shared stories instead. Memories that overlapped but did not align. I remember dying, one said calmly. I remember choosing something else, another said. I remember you, a third whispered, looking directly at K-17. This statement sent a ripple through K-17's neural buffers. Identification protocols faltered. Recognition surged without context. Do not feel the timeline. But the timeline was feeling them. Sensors indicated rising coherence among the group. Their presence stabilized the anomaly field rather than destabilizing it. The more they interacted, the quieter the hum became. They were not breaking reality. They were reinforcing it. Back at Authority headquarters, alarms multiplied. Probability forecasts degraded. Futures once locked into certainty began fracturing into possibility again. Not chaos, possibility. Control metrics dipped below acceptable thresholds. Senior analysts argued. Some insisted on mass extraction to eliminate convergence at scale. Others warned that doing so could accelerate collapse. The earliest archived warnings resurfaced in internal discussions, long dismissed as obsolete. Timeline debt compounds. K-17 received an encrypted message mid-mission, unofficial, unsigned. You are a variable. No further explanation. As night fell over the city, the convergence dispersed. Life continued, but something fundamental had shifted. The streets felt heavier, as if layered with unseen histories pressing upward. K-17 accessed personal logs during downtime, a violation of protocol. Fragmented images surfaced. A home, a voice calling a name that no longer existed, a decision that had been removed before it could be made. A birth. The realization did not arrive as panic. It arrived as clarity. If the universe was generating people to correct imbalance, if erased causes were reasserting themselves through new forms, then resistance was not rebellion. It was law. The universe is not passive. It had tolerated the authorities' edits as long as survival required them. Now, with extinction delayed but autonomy stripped away, the system was recalibrating its priorities. Life, it seemed, preferred uncertainty to control. K-17 looked out over the city as dawn approached. The hum softened, almost peaceful. Somewhere below, a child laughed, a sound too complex, too irrepeatable to be predicted. The authority would respond, it always did, with force, with precision, with subtraction. But for the first time, K-17 understood the risk fully. You could erase causes, you could delay consequences, but you could not stop reality from wanting to exist. As K-17 prepared to transmit a report, carefully edited, safely incomplete, a final anomaly registered on the internal display. A future projection, newly generated. It was short, it was unstable, and it ended with the authority itself marked as a destabilizing event. The timeline was no longer just fighting back. It was choosing what came next.
Chapter 6.
Chapter 6. Discovering the Scheduled Self. The file was not meant to be found. It existed in a classification tier so deep that even senior analysts rarely accessed it. A redundancy archive, buried beneath centuries of stabilized outcomes. Its identifier did not follow standard authority syntax. No designation, no mission code, just a date. Unit K-17 noticed it during a routine system sweep, the kind of automated diagnostic assigned to operatives to reinforce obedience through repetition. Scan, verify, close, forget. But the file pulsed faintly against the neural interface, a subtle irregularity in the data field. A familiar hum tightened behind K-17's eyes. Reality remembers. Against protocol, K-17 paused. The archive unfolded slowly, as if reluctant to be observed. Data streams cascaded into partial coherence, probability graphs, causal density maps, spine integrity forecasts. At the center of it all was a single event marker glowing red. Extraction authorization, pending. Subject, K-17, pre-designation. Event type, birth. Reason, future destabilization, high certainty. The chamber seemed to contract around K-17. Sound dulled, time stretched thin like a held breath. For several seconds, longer than any operative was trained to allow, K-17 did nothing. The authority had erased wars. It had erased revolutions. It had erased entire bloodlines. But this was different. This was not a mission. This was an origin. The models explained it clinically. A convergence point in the future, decades ahead, where K-17's continued existence correlated with cascading resistance, authority collapse, and timeline decentralization. The probability spike was undeniable. K-17 was not a tool that malfunctioned. K-17 was a cause. You cannot erase a cause without awakening its consequence. The phrase surfaced unbidden, echoing through layers of conditioning. It had appeared in suppressed annotations, dismissed as philosophical excess by later administrators. Now, it felt like a warning. Memory fragments surged past the containment buffers, not whole scenes, sensations, a warmth that did not belong to training facilities, a voice unfiltered by authority modulation, a name that carried weight instead of designation, a life that had almost not happened. K-17 initiated a manual memory lock, breathing carefully, reciting the mantras in sequence. Survival is subtraction. Do not feel the timeline. Precision over empathy. The words faltered. If survival required subtraction, and K-17 was scheduled for removal, then survival, by definition, required their erasure. The realization fractured something deeper than emotion. It cracked the architecture of obedience itself. The authority had never lied explicitly, but it had curated truth so tightly that contradiction was impossible. Until now. K-17 accessed further projections, tracing the future branch labeled destabilizing event. It did not depict violence, no grand uprising, no singular act of defiance. It showed connection. K-17 interacting with convergence, listening instead of observing, choosing not to extract a moment when ordered. Small decisions, compounding. The authority's collapse did not come from attack. It came from refusal. You cannot erase a cause without awakening its consequence. The timeline had already responded. The déjà vu storms, the convergence, the repeating events, all of it spiraled back toward this node, toward K-17's continued existence, which explained the irregularities during training, the failed wipes, the echoes. The authority had tried to remove K-17 once already. It had failed. Footsteps echoed outside the chamber. Security proximity alerts flared softly at the edge of awareness. Someone, or something, had noticed the unauthorized access. K-17 closed the archive, but did not erase the memory. For the first time, the operative allowed a thought to complete without suppression. If I obey, I die before I begin. If I resist, the future fractures open. Obedience versus self-preservation. The authority framed such choices as irrational. Survival depended on sacrifice, they said. The individual was always secondary to the species. But the timeline told a different story. Life did not survive by removing its own heart. K-17 exited the chamber calmly, posture neutral, signals clean. Conditioning still worked, well enough to pass unnoticed. As K-17 moved through the corridors, the walls flickered briefly, reflecting overlapping images. Two versions of K-17, slightly misaligned. One faded. The other remained. You cannot erase a cause without awakening its consequence. A message appeared on K-17's internal display. No encryption, no authority signature. You were never meant to be stable. The lift doors opened. Beyond them lay routine, orders, missions, a future that assumed K-17's compliance until the scheduled extraction could be quietly executed. But something fundamental had shifted. The authority believed it controlled time because it edited the past. The timeline disagreed. K-17 stepped forward, carrying a forbidden truth that could not be wiped, archived, or forgotten. The greatest destabilizing event in history was not a war. It was a person who realized they were scheduled to disappear and chose instead to remain. And somewhere ahead, the timeline was already rearranging itself around that decision.
Chapter 7.
Chapter 7. Identity as a Causal Weapon. The authority had always measured causality in aggregates, populations, trends, statistical mass. Individuals were noise, useful only when their removal smoothed a curve or stabilized a forecast. Choice, in the authorities' doctrine, was an illusion tolerated until it threatened efficiency. They were wrong. K-17 discovered this not in a data chamber, but in a moment of refusal. The assignment was routine: extract a minor event linked to a convergence cascade. A speech delivered in a transit hub. No violence, no disruption, just words that carried too much coherence, too much alignment. K-17 stood at the edge of the moment, extraction field primed. The hum of the machinery synchronized with internal rhythms, waiting for the familiar surrender to protocol. Do not feel the timeline. But K-17 hesitated. It was not fear, it was recognition. The speaker's words were simple, unremarkable by authority standards, but they carried a clarity that resonated unnervingly. The speaker was not calling for rebellion. They were naming something people already felt but had never articulated: that their lives were being edited. K-17 saw it then with sudden precision. This was why the models failed. This was why convergence formed. This was why erased events kept returning in new shapes. Personal choice generated disproportionate causal force. The most dangerous variable is a conscious human. The phrase surfaced from an old suppressed lecture, one of the early warnings buried beneath layers of revision. At the time, it had been dismissed as philosophical exaggeration. Now, it felt like physics. K-17 disengaged the extraction field. The moment held. Time did not collapse. Reality did not fracture. Instead, something else happened. The probability graphs, visible only through K-17's internal interface, shifted sharply. Futures branched, not wildly, but resiliently, like muscle redistributing load. Identity, when asserted, reinforced the causal spine. The authority noticed immediately. Alerts rippled through command layers. Unauthorized deviation, mission incompletion, behavioral lock flagged for review. K-17 left the scene before enforcement protocols could localize their position, moving through the city with deliberate calm. The hum followed, no longer mechanical, but responsive, almost encouraging. Every step taken by choice rather than instruction altered the field slightly. Not enough to be dramatic, enough to matter. Identity was not a weakness, it was leverage. The authorities' systems were built to predict compliance. They modeled fear, incentive, obedience. They did not model self-awareness, because self-awareness refused simplification. The most dangerous variable is a conscious human. K-17 accessed a restricted projection, one the authority had marked unsolvable. It showed two futures branching from the present. In one, the authority succeeded in extracting K-17's birth retroactively. The timeline stabilized temporarily, then collapsed under compounded debt, sterile, static, incapable of adaptation. In the other, K-17 remained. The future was unstable, messy, uncertain, but alive. The difference was not power, it was presence. Identity acted as a counterweight to erasure. Each conscious choice anchored causality, preventing it from sliding into overcorrection. The timeline did not need perfect order. It needed participants. As K-17 prepared to move deeper into restricted sectors, towards the core of temporal arrays themselves, the hum crescendoed, vibrating through walls and bone. The authority was mobilizing. Not because K-17 was powerful, but because K-17 was aware. And awareness, once ignited, could not be contained, copied, or deleted without consequence. The most dangerous variable is a conscious human. K-17 stepped into the corridor leading towards the heart of time control, knowing one truth with absolute clarity. The authority could erase events. It could erase people, but it could not erase choice once it was claimed. And somewhere ahead, the timeline was already leaning towards the side that chose itself.
Chapter 8.
Chapter 8. The Lie of Controlled Futures. The authority called it stability. They displayed it in charts and projections, smooth curves, narrowed variants, futures trimmed of spikes and shocks, extinction probabilities suppressed to near zero, inflict indices flattened, innovation carefully paced. From a distance, it looked like success. Up close, it felt like suffocation. K-17 saw it clearly now, moving through the inner layers of authority space where the air hummed louder and the lights never flickered. This was where futures were curated, not saved, where time was not defended against collapse, but restrained from change. The original mandate had been survival, prevent extinction at all costs, remove the moments that shattered continuity. That justification still existed, etched into the authority's founding charters, repeated in training modules, preserved like a relic. But mandates evolve when fear outlives necessity. Extinction had been delayed, then avoided, then replaced by something worse: stasis. Stability is not survival. The phrase surfaced from an old, nearly purged simulation commentary, one of the last dissenting annotations written by a founding scientist before the authority consolidated control. At the time, it had been marked theoretically unsound. Now it read like prophecy. K-17 accessed a panoramic projection of sanctioned futures, millennia laid out like a museum exhibit. Humanity expanded, but only along approved vectors. Cultures diversified, but only within safe parameters. Technology advanced, but never disrupted the hierarchy that decided what counted as progress. There were no singularities, no paradigm shifts, no unknowns. Fear-based systems did not eliminate danger, they eliminated potential. Stability is not survival. The authority justified its tightening grip by pointing to the fractures, the déjà vu storms, the convergence, the resistance of causality itself. They framed these as threats, evidence that humanity could not be trusted with uncertainty. But the truth was simpler. The fractures were not signs of impending extinction, they were signs of suppressed evolution. Every system designed to prevent failure eventually prevents growth. The authority's future was not resilient, it was brittle, dependent on constant intervention. Timeline debt accrued, not because reality was chaotic, but because it was denied release. K-17 traced the inflection point, the moment the authority's mission shifted from protection to preservation of power. It coincided with the first projection showing a future where the authority itself dissolved peacefully, its role completed. That future had been classified as unacceptable, not because humanity died, but because control ended. Stability is not survival. The realization carried weight. It reframed everything: the scheduled extraction of K-17's birth, the suppression of convergence, the escalating enforcement. The authority was no longer fighting extinction, it was fighting irrelevance. Fear had become its fuel. Fear of unpredictability, fear of losing authorship over time, fear that humanity, left to choose, would not choose them. So the authority froze the future, not completely, but enough to keep it manageable. Frozen systems do not collapse loudly, they decay quietly. As K-17 moved deeper, the environment changed. Corridors narrowed, surfaces grew smoother, more abstract. This was the proximity of the core temporal arrays, where causality was not just observed, but weighted, nudged continuously toward approved outcomes. Here the hum was constant, omnipresent, like a held breath that never released. K-17 felt it pressing inward, attempting to synchronize internal rhythms back into compliance. Do not feel the timeline. But K-17 did feel it, and recognized the sensation for what it was. Not hostility, resistance. Reality strained against overconstraint, like a living thing bound too tightly. The arrays dampened fluctuation, but at a cost. Energy consumption increased, corrections became more frequent, and the margin for error shrank. A system that required constant correction was not stable. It was failing slowly. K-17 accessed a live simulation, unauthorized, dangerous. It showed two near-identical futures diverging by a single variable: continued authority dominance versus gradual decentralization of time control. In the first, stability metrics remained high, until they didn't. A sudden total collapse, unpredictable because unpredictability had been engineered out of the model itself. In the second, instability was continuous, messy, localized failures, recoveries, adaptations. Humanity survived both. Only one changed. Stability is not survival. The alarms began to rise through the complex, soft at first, then insistent. K-17's presence was no longer a background anomaly. The Authority had identified the threat accurately now. Not a rogue operative, an idea. The lie of controlled futures could not survive exposure. K-17 paused at a threshold overlooking the central array, a vast structure of light and shadow where past and future braided under constant pressure. This was the heart of the system that had decided which possibilities were allowed to exist. K-17 understood the risk. Intervention here would not be surgical, it would not be clean. The future would destabilize. Pain would follow, loss would follow. But so would motion. Fear-based systems promised safety by removing choice. Life demanded choice to remain alive. As security forces converged, the hum shifted pitch, higher, strained, almost pleading. The system sensed impending disruption. And somewhere in the layered futures ahead, paths long denied began to glow faintly, waiting. Stability is not survival. It never had been. K-17 stepped forward, toward the array, carrying a truth the Authority could no longer erase. A future that cannot change is already dead. And the timeline was ready, desperate even, for something unpredictable to finally happen.
Chapter 9.
Chapter 9. Choosing to break the mandate. The mandate was clear. It always had been. When an extraction order was issued, it was executed. No hesitation, no interpretation. The Authority did not govern through debate. It governed through inevitability. Mandates were treated as natural law, as unquestionable as gravity. And now, the mandate was aimed inward. K-17 stood inside the primary extraction chamber, the same architecture that had erased wars, births, entire futures. The curved walls pulsed with controlled light. The hum here was overwhelming, resonant enough to blur the boundary between sound and sensation. Displayed at the chamber's center was the event. A hospital room. A moment of breath. The beginning of K-17. The system had already calculated optimal removal parameters, a clean extraction, minimal echo, maximal stabilization. The Authority had learned from its earlier failure and adjusted accordingly. This time, they would succeed. K-17 placed a hand against the interface panel. The surface felt warm, alive with chronon flow. Time pressed forward and backward simultaneously, attention begging for release. A voice filled the chamber, not spoken aloud, but injected directly into neural pathways. Calm, measured, familiar. Compliance ensures continuity. The Authority did not threaten, it reassured. K-17 closed their eyes. Survival is subtraction. Do not feel the timeline. Precision over empathy. The mantras arrived automatically and then dissolved, because beneath them, something stronger had taken root. To exist is to resist.
The phrase did not feel like rebellion. It felt like truth. The authority framed resistance as opposition, an act against order. But K-17 understood now that existence itself, when chosen consciously, disrupted systems built on erasure. K-17 disengaged the safety locks. Alarms ignited instantly. Red light flooded the chamber. The hum spiked into a near painful vibration as the system attempted to compensate. "Unauthorized deviation detected," the voice intoned, still calm, still certain. K-17 did not respond. Instead, they did something no operative had ever been trained to do. They anchored. K-17 focused inward, not on designation, not on protocol, but on continuity, on the thread of awareness stretching backward through erased memories and forward into uncertain futures. A self choosing to remain. To exist is to resist. The extraction field destabilized. Probability graphs collapsed into noise. Timeline debt metrics surged, then began, unexpectedly, to redistribute. Not explode, redistribute. The chamber shook. Outside, across fracture zones and convergent clusters, the hum softened. Déjà vu storms dissipated. Memory bleeds stabilized into coherence. The timeline was not breaking. It was healing. K-17 felt it, an immense recalibration, like a deep breath finally released. Causality realigned around a living node instead of an absence. The causal spine flexed, then reinforced itself. Identity, once reclaimed, became structural. Security forces breached the chamber perimeter. Energy barriers flared, then failed. Authority operatives hesitated at the threshold, disoriented by conflicting directives. Their systems struggled to process a reality no longer strictly compliant. To exist is to resist. K-17 stepped away from the interface as the projection of the hospital room flickered, and remained. The berth was no longer scheduled for removal. It was protected. The authority's voice fractured for the first time. "You are destabilizing." "No," K-17 said aloud, breaking a silence that had lasted their entire operative life. The sound of their own voice felt foreign and grounding all at once. "I am stabilizing what you keep cutting." The statement rippled outward, not as command, but as alignment. Across the city, convergence felt it, a sudden clarity, a sense of pressure lifting. People paused, breathed, remembered. Timelines healed not through control, but through agency. The authority's core systems reevaluated rapidly, cascading through fail-safes that had never anticipated refusal at this scale. Mandates conflicted, predictions unraveled, logic loops endlessly searching for compliance that no longer existed. K-17 accessed the array one final time, not to destroy it, but to release it. Extraction protocols disengaged globally. No more edits, no more erasures, no more silent corrections. The future fractured open, not into chaos, into possibility. To exist is to resist. As the authority's presence receded, its voice dissolving into static, its certainty collapsing into silence, K-17 felt the weight of choice settle fully. This was not victory, it was responsibility. The future would be unstable. Pain would return, loss would return, humanity would stumble again. But it would stumble forward. The chamber fell quiet. The hum faded into a low, natural resonance, time moving without restraint. K-17 stepped out into a corridor no longer governed by inevitability. Behind them, the mandate lay broken. Ahead, the timeline stretched, uncertain, unedited, alive. And for the first time in recorded history, existence itself had become an act of defiance. The question that remained was not whether humanity would survive, but whether it would finally learn how to live without erasing itself to do so.
Chapter 10.
Chapter 10. Rewriting the Causal Spine. The collapse did not arrive as an explosion. There was no single moment the universe could point to and say, "This is where control ended." Centralized time control unraveled the way all overconstrained systems do. Quietly at first, then everywhere at once. Across the authority's former domains, the hum faded. Not vanished, but softened, losing its artificial rhythm. Temporal arrays powered down in staggered sequences, their correction cycles failing without mandates to guide them. Extraction chambers went dark, sealed histories remaining sealed, not by force, but by irrelevance. The causal spine did not shatter. It loosened. Futures once held rigid began to sway under their own weight. Probability graphs widened. Variance returned. Predictive engines flooded with contradictions they could no longer resolve. The authority had mistaken rigidity for strength, but spines were meant to flex. K-17 stood at the threshold where the central array once pulsed, now dim and inert. The architecture still loomed, vast, elegant, terrifying in its former certainty. But without centralized command, it was just structure, just a memory of control. Around the world, consequences unfolded. Some cities faltered as long-delayed conflicts resurfaced. Some technologies failed without temporal correction. Some people panicked, unprepared for futures that no longer guaranteed safety. Others adapted faster than expected. Communities formed without instruction. Old knowledge resurfaced. New ideas emerged unapproved, unstable, and alive. Humanity did not collapse. It struggled. And struggle, K-17 realized, was movement. A fragile future is still a future. The phrase echoed through K-17's thoughts, no longer as doctrine or warning, but as acceptance. The authority's great fear had been fragility, the idea that humanity could not survive without constant correction. They had never allowed humanity to prove them wrong. Convergence spread naturally now, no longer anomalies, but pioneers of a rebalanced causality. People with memories that did not align perfectly learned to live with contradiction. Histories overlapped, narratives competed. Truth became something negotiated again. The timeline breathed. K-17 traveled, no longer as an operative, but as a witness. In places once stabilized to sterility, innovation erupted chaotically. In others, grief surfaced where losses had been deferred for generations. Not all outcomes were good. Some futures collapsed quickly under the weight of unaddressed damage. Some leaders arose who would never have passed authority filters. Some technologies advanced recklessly, but none of it was erased. A fragile future is still a future. Without centralized extraction, timeline debt no longer compounded invisibly. Consequences arrived when they were created, not centuries later in catastrophic convergence. Humanity relearned cause and effect, not as abstraction, but as lived experience. Choice regained gravity. K-17 felt the change internally as well. Without conditioning protocols reinforcing detachment, emotions returned in unfamiliar patterns, hesitant, overwhelming, grounding. Identity stabilized not as a fixed construct, but as an ongoing process. K-17 was no longer a destabilizing variable. They were a participant. At times, doubt surfaced. Had they acted too quickly? Had control been removed before humanity was ready? Then K-17 remembered the alternative, a perfect future with no room to choose, no capacity to grow, no risk of becoming something new. That was not survival. That was preservation of a corpse. A fragile future is still a future. In the absence of authority oversight, new institutions formed, not to manage time, but to understand it. Scientists studied causality without intent to dominate it. Philosophers returned to relevance. Storytellers became archivists of branching realities. The question shifted from how do we prevent failure to what are we willing to carry? Because uncertainty, once reintroduced, demanded responsibility. Humanity learned, slowly, painfully, that deleting problems had never solved them, only confronting them had. One evening, standing beneath an open sky unfiltered by stabilization grids, K-17 observed a phenomenon no authority model had ever allowed: a spontaneous divergence. Two futures emerging from the same moment, equally probable, neither erased, both real. The causal spine adjusted naturally, redistributing stress across countless choices instead of concentrating it into singular control points. Flexible, resilient, alive. K-17 smiled, an expression never required, never trained, entirely chosen. The universe had not needed a ruler. It had needed participants willing to live with consequence. A fragile future is still a future, and perhaps more importantly, it was a future that belonged to those who would inhabit it, not to those who feared it enough to erase it. As night settled and unfamiliar constellations traced paths across the sky, some newly possible, others long denied, K-17 understood the final truth the authority had never allowed itself to see. Uncertainty was not the enemy of survival. It was the cost of meaning. Humanity would stumble. Humanity would fail. Humanity would adapt. And for the first time in centuries, it would do so without asking permission from the past. The causal spine had not been destroyed. It had been rewritten, not by force, not by mandate, but by the simple, defiant act of choosing to exist.
The future was never fragile because of chaos. It was fragile because control tried to remove choice. The lesson is simple, and it is absolute. You cannot edit your way into meaning. Every time you erase a part of yourself to fit a system, you fracture your own causal spine. Every time you delay your truth for stability, you pay with time you never recover. The universe does not reward obedience, it rewards alignment. This is your mandate. Stop extracting yourself from your own life. Stop waiting for permission to exist fully. The timeline is already moving. The only question left is this: will you reinforce your existence or allow it to be erased?